Now I'd like to present Molly Elgin-Cossart as our next presenter.
Okay. So good morning, and it's such an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And as I start, I wanted to share something with you as I was preparing, how completely amazing it was for me to think about, here I am in 2016, standing in the National Academies talking about violence prevention in the Sustainable Development Agenda. Now, to give you perspective on that, when I started working on this agenda 4 years ago, there was some talk about, as we transition from MDGs, we want a broader agenda. We really think it's important to have peace and prevention of violence as part of this agenda. And to give you an American analogy, this is something akin to saying, you know what, it's really important that we pass immigration reform in Congress this year. So you can imagine that, to me, I had this surreal moment thinking this happened. We got here, it's in the agenda. We have this incredible opportunity to turn into something real and actionable. So that was, the amazing thought that sort of struck me as I was preparing these remarks, was just how far we've come. What did I do? Oh, this is the end. Okay, well, you're gonna get a sneak preview. So it wasn't because people didn't think that peace or the prevention of violence was important. Actually, those were mentioned in the Millennium Declaration, the document in 2000 that was the foundation for the Millennium Development Goals. It didn't get translated into the goals. Now, that's for a lot of reasons. It was a novel experiment. A lot of those reasons are very political. You can imagine there was a lot of objections. It wasn't that it was forgotten, and it was a bit intentional that it was left out. But everybody knew that it still mattered. So I took this quote. Now, obviously, there's all different forms of violence, and this matters across, but this is just one illustrative example that this was really sort of bubbling beneath the surface the whole time. So this is a report from 2005 from the Millennium Project. They had this task force on education and gender equality. So MDG 3 on gender equality, they said, okay, what are we going to do to achieve this goal by 2015? And one of their priority strategies was preventing violence against women. Why? Because they realized that this goal, which was pretty traditional development goal, it didn't mention violence, but they realized it would be completely impossible to achieve this if you didn't think about violence. So just a quick illustrative example that it was there. So we did learn those lessons. Now, partially that was advocacy, and partially it was these sort of moments of realizing that you just can't accomplish the goals you think you can without thinking about preventing violence. And so now we have this agenda that, as both Jim and Tony have mentioned, is universal. So this applies everywhere. So violence is a great example of this, as we were just discussing and was clear in the slides, that violence is something that affects cities in the United States and rural areas in the United States just as much as anywhere else. So we have this universal agenda now that is broader, that aims to cover over 7 billion people instead of just 1 billion, those living under 125 a day, as the MDGs did. It aims to be integrated. And it aims to address these deeper causes and not just sort of surface level interventions. Those are all really ambitious aims. And to let you in on a secret, I'm not sure that we entirely know how to get there, which is where you come in. So what is sustainable development, right? So we've gone from the development agenda, we talk about the sustainable development agenda. We talk about that. What you'll see in the documents and the discussions at the UN is the 5 Ps. So people, it's been mentioned, Tony mentioned, leave no one behind. And this idea is, the MDGs, and I don't mean this as a critique, focused on averages. That's sort of a sign of the times and what it was, but sort of reducing poverty by half, right? That's very different from saying completely eliminate poverty or completely eliminate something, different approaches. So every single person, and really putting individuals, and especially the most vulnerable and marginalized, as Tony was saying, at the forefront. So that's a different concept. You need a different approach. Planet. So the idea that tackling climate change and preserving the planet and our resources is separate from development is completely eliminated. Say, actually, these are all integrated. This is the environment in which we live. This is part and parcel of who we are and how we function in societies. Prosperity. So that obviously is requires some big changes in the economy. Our current approach in economics often leaves youth unemployed. It leaves vulnerable populations struggling to access bank accounts, to access the economy, to be a part of society. And so that needs to change. Peace. So this obviously is a big component of what you're focused on here. And as I discussed, that this is really the underlying, without peace, without nonviolence, we can't accomplish any of these broader goals. Something, again, as I said, that was in the Millennium Declaration, but was not a part of the Millennium Development Goals. And partnerships. So Tony mentioned this, that partnerships are incredibly important. This is, obviously governments are at the center of this, but this is not really a government, solely a government objective or solely a government endeavor. You really need all of society. You need civil society, you need academics and researchers, you need businesses. So the idea is, can we come together in more effective partnerships to cut across some of these silos and affect change together? So that's a sort of general, conception of partnerships. There's also specific partnerships that you're going to hear more about today, including one on ending violence against children that I think is a really exciting example of what the future, the SDGs could look like, of how we move from broad aspirations to implementation. So these are the goals, as has been mentioned before. So there's 17 of them. And the exciting thing, of course, is that embedded across them is violence prevention. So goal 16 is the obvious one, I think, that most people think about when they say violence prevention or peace. That's the goal that is broadly on peaceful societies, on governance, on effective and accountable institutions. So that's great. It has its own goal with a lot of subcomponents. But importantly, you can't just say, okay, we're kind of, that's politically and technically difficult to do. Let's shove that goal aside and we can still meet the rest of the goals, which obviously you can't do anyway. But knowing that, it's embedded across the other goals. So goals on cities, goals on education. Obviously, the prevention of violence matters for all of these. And then, as Jim mentioned, here are some of the specific examples. There's more. I just picked a few examples. So to take a step back and think about, all right, so we have these goals, we have this opportunity, which, as I said, is actually a really incredible opportunity that I think is a bit unexpected. So what can goals do? What can we actually do with them? So broadly, I was thinking about what are the pathways to change? Why do we have these big global goals? So partially it's shaping norms. So by analogy with the MDGs changed the way that we thought about development from a sort of Washington consensus economic growth model that had been dominant into a much more socially focused model. Now, by analogy then, SDGs is switching us into a different gear of thinking more holistically about, okay, we think about the individual, we think about the environment, we think about some of these deeper root causes that are, messy and difficult and probably hard to measure, but they're incredibly important and we can do it. Tools for public advocacy, so they're an incredibly effective public tool, right? You have heads of state, President Obama was at this summit for sustainable development, many other heads of state, and they've signed up to this. They've said, we think this is really important, we agree to do this, and that provides a hook. You can say, you said you were going to do this, what have you done? We can measure that. We can look at the indicators and say, where are you on progress? We can look at the implementation. Where are your strategies? Where are your plans? Who's working on this? So it's an incredibly effective advocacy tool. And the third point is it's a common reference point for policy. So it allows us to move in the same direction, to say this is what we're going towards. It provides guidance as far as policies. It starts to allow us to measure things. So this allows us to take something as broad as, okay, we'd like to prevent violence and say, okay, well, how are we going to do that and move in the same direction instead of all having different theories or approaches of how we do it. So if we say that generally, and as we've mentioned, obviously that is not just governments. That requires a lot of different actors across society. The comments that I will make are a little bit more focused from a governmental perspective, not because I think that that's all that's needed, just because that's an interesting entry point, especially as we get started. So with that in mind, I did want to take a moment and think a little bit, and this is not comprehensive, but think a little bit about the challenges. So one is context. So we have a very different global context from what we had in 2000 when the MDGs were beginning to be formulated. So at that time we had, just breakaway global economic growth. It looked like we were having a diminishment in global conflicts. And since then, obviously, those trends have changed. We've had increasing inequality in a lot of parts of the world, with some exceptions, but across all different income levels. So, and a slowing of the global economy, and we've started to see an uptick in conflicts. So, just a note to say, more generally, any goal exists within a context, as we know, and so this is going to make it that much more challenging. And obviously, the goals themselves are different as well. Poor data, so that's not particularly different from the MDGs. Obviously, there was poor data then as well. I'd actually like to say that there's a lot of hope here. We've had a lot of improvement in availability of data, in our methodologies, technology since 2000 that can allow us to get a better handle on what the problems are and how we can more effectively target interventions if we do it wisely. And there are some promising efforts in this regard. There is a global partnership for sustainable development data, and there's several other efforts through the UN to improve statistical capacity, but also look at less official data as well. So fragmentation, and these are observations as sort of not a member of the Academies or of the community, something from my seat as a policy person, and having spoken with a lot of people who were advocating for all these goals and targets. So fragmentation of this community. So when we talk about violence, right, what are we talking about? There's a lot of different kinds and a lot of different communities. So you have different researchers and experts and advocates and government agencies that often don't speak to each other and see these as very different problems. So I'm reminded of a comment in a conversation with some folks on Goal 16 who work on global conflict and UN peacekeeping specifically. And they were saying, yeah, we work on war, we don't work on violence. Which I get, right? I understand what you're saying. To the layperson or to an average policy person, it's a little confusing to think you work on war and not violence. Okay. So just as illustrative of, I don't think that helps if we talk about in this, big agenda that is going to be a challenge, it is very ambitious. If you really care about taking that embedded violence prevention and really making that a priority and really implementing change, because of that, I think it's not helpful to have very different communities arguing slightly different theories, slightly different strategies, do need to come together. Now, that's always a challenge, come together and not sort of get lowest common denominator. But I see that as a challenge simply because it makes it harder to make your case to get political and political backing and resources, which you need to make change. And the lack of practical policy relevant evidence and guidance. Now it is there, so I don't mean that as there's not anything there. It's more that there's a lot of different, as I was saying, partially because of this fragmentation, there's a lot of different theories, strategies about what to do. That can be very confusing for policymakers. It makes it hard to know where to start, right? We have this big agenda, where do we get started? And also, one thing that I've noticed is a disconnect between, academics and experts we would talk to in doing this and policymakers, right, as sort of, this is a great theory, or this is a really interesting, experiment with a randomized control trial or quasi-experimental evidence that shows this is really effective. What do I do with that? How do I translate that to policy in a really practical way? And without getting caught up in the, oh, this is really complex, violence is really complex, society is, yes, of course, yes, it is. And I don't mean to, sort of to the detriment of all that amazing research, say, simplify to the point where it's useless. But I think maybe gleaning out from that, what is practical for policymakers? What can they do? How can you motivate, an agency to change a strategy? How can you, pull out something really practical that they can grab on? Because otherwise, presented with really broad aspirational goals and, a lot of different theories and a lot of research that's interesting but not quite sure how it translates, you can kind of get a situation where you throw your hands up and just nothing changes. And that is, as I see it, a challenge and a risk. So one of the challenges I mentioned was on, and this is just one, there's plenty of work to do, but I thought that evidence and data is something that might just be a good way of explaining, translating from these broad ambitions to practical ways forward. So this is from a Brazilian think tank, Igarape, and I have two slides that I want to show you. So this is Mexico. So if you go onto their website, this think tank's website, they have this homicide monitor, right? So they have a globe, you can click on a country, you can see all the data in that country. So I went on it, I clicked on Mexico. And what you can see here is on the left, you can click on it, and what's brought up here is, okay, you can see what percentage of the victims are male. Right? So this says 89%. A lot of it's, drug gangs, things like that. What are their ages? You can see they're quite young. You can click on cities. I didn't do this, but you can click on cities here, and it'll pop up, okay, here's cities, above population of 250,000, and it'll tell you what their rates are. States as well within Mexico. So you can click through, and there's all this data that you can access to start to get an understanding of, okay, where are the problem areas that can help you start to target your interventions. Then you go to Nigeria, which is another country that obviously that has a lot of problems with violence. And this is what you get. You can't click on anything because it's not there. And that Nigeria is not the only country, obviously, that has that problem. But it was just really interesting to go through and see exactly what we're dealing with. And you can imagine that if you are a policymaker and you're thinking, how do I obviously we know that the north of Nigeria is the problem. How do I really get a grip on, okay, what is the specific, what are specific elements here? What kind of interventions would be most effective? And you have nothing with which to make that decision and to direct your very scarce resources. It kind of makes you feel like it's helpless, and it certainly makes it less solvable. So again, there's plenty of problems, but I thought that was one thing that kind of generating evidence and data can help us move into action. So what can governments do? So the first thing is to just champion the SDGs. Obviously, having political will and political backing makes it really important. It keeps it in the headlines. It keeps people motivated and moving. And really great to hear Tony say, how much the U.S. is focused on it, and that they have, that U.S. leadership has come forward to say, we absolutely support this. So that is really important. Next is embedding SDGs into national strategies and plans. So this happened pretty erratically with the MDGs. So some countries really took it on, the MDGs. A couple of them as a whole, mostly it was a bit more part and parcel of sort of, okay, this part really resonates here. And they actually put it into national strategies, and not just sort of in the development sphere, but have some countries where the Ministry of Finance, they were doing their poverty reduction strategies and included bits of the MDGs, or countries where they created a parliamentary oversight committee to hold to account the executive on what are you actually doing on this. So the more that you embed those, and that can be in national, that can also be in subnational. Interestingly, a lot of cities are already doing this, cities in the US. So New York is doing this, San Jose. So this is also, it's going to happen at a subnational level as well. And then you can do it at, regional levels. You can imagine also, say, G7, G20. So the more that you kind of get as I said, it's a common reference point. So if you can get this common reference point integrated across multiple strategies, you start to align things in a direction where it's more likely you get action. Whole of society approaches. So we often talk about whole of government, that this is not just something for one branch of the government, it's across. With SDGs, it's really whole of society. You really, especially this idea of inclusion, right? You want civil society and communities involved. You want businesses involved. And you want to make sure that this is not just sort of government sitting around, coming up with plans, and then implementing it, but that each part of that is really participatory. And you're bringing in experts such as yourselves and civil society. Now, on paper, that's there, right? That's part of the commitment. That realization has come. That is a bit of an uncomfortable place for a lot of governments. It's a very uncomfortable place, I will say, for the United Nations. So I'm curious to watch how that actually happens. How do we actually integrate folks that are outside of government into making this happen? And that also, I think, is part of the burden on folks here, is to say, okay, how can we really make sure that our voices are being heard? And results in accountability. And governments can bring together, right? You can convene technical communities like this. You can bring together mayors across these different communities. And so lastly, I was thinking about, okay, so what really needs to be done and what can this group do? I think the most important thing that I would hope that you walk away from this with is we really need to come forward with concrete ways to turn these ambitions into practical policy guidance that you can just hand a sort of to-do to a policymaker. And they will say, yes, okay, I'm convinced, I believe violence prevention matters, here's what I can do about it. I think there's a few keys to that. One, I already discussed overcoming the fragmentation. Two is a clear and compelling narrative. So often we get kind of either academic or something that doesn't resonate, that is so full of the hopeless. So there's a sort of psychology of policy. You need to present things in a way that it seems like change is possible and doable. So some success stories. So I, as a policymaker, say, okay, yes, we can do something about this. Two, what do I do? And make that case. And I do think the Partnership to End Violence Against Children has done a great job of this. They've said, no child should live in fear. Children can't fulfill their potential if they can't go to school because there's violence. They can't go to a health clinic, et cetera. That resonates with me. It resonates with me as a parent, but it resonates with me just as a human being. I think policymakers will get that. And obviously that helps with the raising and allocating funds because you do, let's face it, you need resources, technical and financial. And then, as I said, part of it is just developing those really practical policies and harnessing some of the potential of new methods, new technologies. So I'll leave you with just one thought on the technologies. I was speaking with a minister of Nigeria at an event here last week, and she was saying, everybody knows about Boko Haram. We were missing all those girls. We then found out we're missing even more people that we didn't know about because we don't have any kind of central registry in Nigeria. So we're missing a lot of our citizens that we don't even know about. Well, there's fabulous advances in digital IDs, for instance, countries like India have taken advantage of. Is there something to do to connect there? So just, starting to connect these communities is really important. So leave you with that. There's a lot of work to be done, but it's incredibly exciting. I can't believe we're here, that we have this in this agenda. So let's do something with it. And I'd really hope to see you be a part of that.